The sound of shattering glass jolted me awake, a sharp contrast to the silence of the night. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then came the unmistakable roar of laughter, loud, obnoxious, and definitely not mine. My stomach twisted with unease as I threw off my covers and staggered toward the window. My bedroom faced the front of my house, and as I pulled back the curtain, my breath hitched in my throat. Flames flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow against the dark sky, and thick plumes of smoke curled upward. Panic shot through me like a jolt of electricity. Something was burning, and whatever it was far too close to my house. My heart pounded against my ribs as I whipped around, threw on the first pair of shoes I could find, and bolted down the stairs. Flinging the front door open, I was greeted with absolute chaos. My yard, once carefully maintained, was now a war zone. Strangers, most of them already drunk, were sprawled across my lawn, dancing on my flower beds, shattering beer bottles against the pavement, and laughing, as though they weren't turning my property into a disaster. The flickering flames weren't from some controlled fire pit. They were from a bonfire someone had recklessly lit in the middle of my driveway. I scanned the crowd, my fury growing with each new horror I uncovered. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on my garage door. A dented trash can lay overturned, its contents strewn across my lawn. My fence, which had stood tall and sturdy just that morning, had been knocked down in places, leaving jagged wooden posts sticking up like broken bones, and at the center of it all, wine glass in hand, phone raised for a selfie, was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the same woman who had once tried to fine me for having a non-conforming mailbox color. My rage burned white-hot as I shoved my way through the crowd, narrowly avoiding a group of teenagers haphazardly throwing fireworks at each other. The ground crunched under my feet, littered with glass, crushed beer cans, and the remains of what had once been my flower pots. My driveway was blocked off by a stranger's car, its doors left wide open as someone blasted music so loud the bass vibrated through my bones. The closer I got to the fire, the worse it became. The flames had spread dangerously close to my garage, licking up the wooden fence that separated my house from my neighbors. The smoke burned my lungs as I pushed forward, ignoring the jeering looks and drunken laughter from the partygoers. When I finally reached Karen, my voice came out in a furious snarl. "What the hell is going on?" "Oh, relax," she sighed, rolling her eyes. "It's just a little community gathering." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of her words. "A community gathering?" I echoed. "Karen, this is my property. You broke in, trashed my yard, and set a damn fire." She waved a dismissive hand, as if I were being unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's not like you were using it." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "That's not the point," I snapped. "You're trespassing and—" Karen finally turned to fully face me, that smug smirk curling across her lips like a predator who thought she'd already won. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed. "You're part of the HOA, and the HOA has a rule about unutilized spaces being open for neighborhood enjoyment." My blood boiled at her words. "That's complete BS, and you know it," I shot back. She shrugged, swirling the wine in her glass like she wasn't standing in the middle of a crime scene. "Well, I suppose you could call the police," she mused, her tone dripping with fake innocence. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice just enough for only me to hear. "But we both know they're not going to do anything." My stomach twisted as I followed her gaze. My blood ran cold. She was right, at least partially, because standing among the chaos, laughing and drinking like they weren't sworn officers of the law, were at least 2 local cops. Karen straightened, flashing me a self-satisfied smile. "Look, we're just trying to foster a sense of community," she said smoothly. "We have guests over, and I couldn't just let them sit in the heat, could I?" My grip on my temper tightened as I took in the absolute destruction surrounding me. Beer bottles shattered across my driveway, people climbing onto my patio furniture as if it were their own. The bonfire burning hotter, the flames stretching dangerously close to my house. My home, my sanctuary, turned into a lawless wasteland, and Karen had the nerve to act like I was the problem. I exhaled sharply, forcing my anger into something cold and calculated. "You have 10 minutes to clear out," I said, voice steady despite the fury beneath it, "or I'm shutting this down myself." Karen's smirk deepened. "Oh, honey," she purred, "you can try." And just like that, she turned her back on me, dismissing me in my own damn driveway. That was it. I turned and stormed back inside, my hands shaking, not with fear but with pure, seething rage. Karen thought she had me cornered. She thought I was trapped, too afraid to escalate, but she had just made a fatal mistake. I pulled out my phone, heart racing, and started making calls. By the time I was done, Karen's community gathering was about to become a community disaster. I called Karen's landlord. Karen's self-righteous fury was almost impressive, if it weren't so pathetic. She had trespassed, thrown a full-blown party in my pool, and then got humiliated in front of all her guests, yet somehow she still believed she was the victim. Now she was out on the warpath, clipboard in hand, hunting for allies. I watched from my porch, arms crossed, as she knocked on door after door, spinning whatever twisted version of events she had cooked up. She gestured dramatically toward my house, no doubt selling some nonsense about my dangerous behavior or how I was threatening the integrity of the community. I had expected a reaction, but this was next-level insanity. By the time she reached my driveway, I was already waiting. "Karen," I greeted smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't even pretend to be polite. "I've spoken with multiple homeowners who agree that your actions are a direct violation of community standards." I raised an eyebrow. "Which community standards would those be? The ones where people don't trespass onto private property? Or the ones where they don't throw unauthorized parties in someone else's backyard?" Her lip curled, but she flipped her clipboard around, jabbing at a freshly printed document. "We're proposing an emergency HOA amendment, one that allows for reasonable community use of underutilized private amenities." I stared at her for a full 3 seconds before I burst into laughter. "So, let me get this straight. You want to legally steal people's property?" Karen's face reddened. "It's about fostering community spirit," she snapped. "It's about ensuring that selfish homeowners like you don't hoard resources that could benefit everyone." My laughter died. I stepped forward, my voice even, controlled. "Karen, let me be very clear. If you or anyone else steps foot on my property again without permission, I will press trespassing charges." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. She flipped her hair over her shoulder and scoffed. "We'll see what the community decides." With that, she turned and strutted away, her clipboard clutched like a sword. I exhaled slowly, watching her go. Oh, she wanted a battle. She was about to get a war. That night, I doubled down. Karen was pulling neighbors into her scheme, so I did the same, except I wasn't lying. I knocked on doors, had honest conversations, and, surprise, surprise, people were fed up. "Oh, I hate Karen," one neighbor admitted, crossing her arms. "She fined me for having the wrong shade of beige on my front door. She's tried to rewrite HOA rules before," another said, shaking his head, "always for her own benefit." By the end of the night, I had more than enough support to counter whatever nonsense Karen was planning. But I wasn't stopping there. I stayed up late, digging through every single page of the HOA bylaws, searching for anything that could shut her down for good. And then I found it, a loophole. Karen? She wasn't even a homeowner, she was renting, and according to the HOA's own bylaws, only homeowners could hold positions of authority on the board. Karen had no legal power. None. I sat back in my chair, grinning. Tomorrow, I wasn't just fighting back, I was ending her reign for good. Karen's sheer level of insanity was even worse than I expected. Filing bogus HOA violations was one thing, but dragging the city government into her personal vendetta, that was a new low even for her. By noon, a city inspector actually showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, looking vaguely apologetic. "I'm just here to do a routine check," he said. I let him in, already anticipating the outcome. I led him to the backyard where my pool, now back to its normal pristine blue, sparkled under the midday sun. The inspector walked the perimeter, took a few notes, then knelt by the water and did a quick chemical test. Within minutes, he shook his head. "Yeah, this is just normal pool water. Whoever filed this report either doesn't know what they're talking about or was being deliberately misleading." I smirked. "I'm betting on both." The inspector sighed and jotted something down. "I'll be filing this as an unnecessary complaint. Shouldn't affect you at all." That was a relief, but it still made my blood boil. Karen had wasted city resources just to harass me. I wasn't letting this slide. Time to go nuclear. I called a lawyer. After explaining the entire situation, my lawyer was very interested. "You have video evidence of her trespassing, documented harassment, and now a false complaint filed against you?" he asked, his voice sharp with interest. "Yeah." He let out a low chuckle. "You have a solid case for a cease and desist at the very least." That was exactly what I needed. The next morning I had a formal cease and desist letter drafted, but I wasn't stopping there. I wanted to hit her where it really hurt. The HOA meeting. That evening I walked into the meeting room prepared. Karen was already seated at the front, acting like she was running a presidential debate. A handful of neighbors were there, some supportive of her, but plenty who were just tired of her antics. As soon as I walked in, she smirked. "Oh, look who decided to show up." I smirked back. "Oh, don't worry, I wouldn't miss this for the world." The meeting began, and right on cue, Karen launched into a speech about community, unity, and respecting shared spaces. She framed the entire situation as if I had wronged the neighborhood, twisting facts and using flowery language to make herself seem like the victim. Then she pulled out her biggest play. "To avoid future conflicts," she announced dramatically, "I am proposing a new bylaw allowing community access to unused private amenities for scheduled neighborhood events." I raised a hand. Question. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time as I challenged her authority. "Yes?" she asked, already convinced she had me trapped. I kept my expression neutral. Who determines if a private amenity is considered unused? Karen straightened her shoulders. "The HOA board, of course," she said smugly. I nodded. "And who's on the HOA board?" She lifted her chin. "The elected members, including myself." I took a step closer. "So, you get to decide if my pool is unused and then take it over?" There was a brief flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she quickly recovered. "It's a fair system," she declared. I pulled out a folder, flipping it open with deliberate slowness. "No," I said evenly, "what's fair is following actual legal property laws." I slid the first document across the table, the official cease and desist letter, stamped and signed by my lawyer. "This is a formal notice regarding Karen's harassment, trespassing, and false complaints against me. If it continues, I will be pursuing legal action." Karen's face paled, but I wasn't finished. I reached into my folder and pulled out another document. "I did some digging," I continued smoothly. "Karen isn't even a homeowner." The room fell into stunned silence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the board members and gathered neighbors. "Wait, is that true?" one of the board members finally asked, his brow furrowed. I placed the rental records in front of them. According to the HOA bylaws, only homeowners can hold positions on the board. More murmurs, a few gasps, and then the inevitable wave of chaos. Neighbors who had been bullied by Karen for years seized the moment, their patience finally snapping. People who had never spoken up before were suddenly eager to air their grievances. Someone scoffed. "She fined me for having my recycling bin out an hour early." Another voice piped up. "She tried to ticket my kid's lemonade stand for violating commercial zoning laws." The HOA president looked increasingly uncomfortable, flipping through the rental records, clearly realizing the implications. He held up a hand to calm the rising tension. "We'll need to verify this," he started, but Karen's panicked expression told me she already knew the truth. There was nothing to verify. She had no legal authority. Her reign was over. A vote was called, and this time there was no hesitation. The decision was unanimous. Karen was removed from the HOA board immediately. And the best part? Because she wasn't a homeowner, she had no right to contest the vote. As the meeting wrapped up, I leaned in just enough for her to hear, "Looks like you were the one trespassing all along." She had no response. No retort, no smug comeback. Just a blank, stunned expression as the weight of her downfall crashed down on her. The queen of the HOA had officially fallen. The room erupted into quiet conversations as neighbors processed what had just happened. Some were thrilled, whispering excitedly to one another. Others looked relieved, shaking their heads at the absurdity of how much power Karen had wielded over the community for so long. The HOA president, now looking more confident in his decision, cleared his throat and gave a short nod. This meeting is adjourned." The sound of the gavel slamming down was final, an unspoken declaration that Karen was finished. Karen stood so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. Her fingers clenched around her clipboard as though it was a lifeline, her face shifting from red to pale and back again. "This is a witch hunt," she hissed. "You'll regret this." But no one cared. The spell had been broken, her influence had been shattered. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. A breath of silence followed, then a slow, almost believing round of applause. I leaned back, exhaling. It was done. Or so I thought. The next morning I woke up early, half expecting some form of retaliation. I checked my property, anticipating some petty attempt at revenge. Spray paint, trash dumped on my lawn, or a brand new HOA violation notice tacked onto my door. But nothing was out of place. No evidence of Karen's usual antics. A small part of me wondered if I had actually broken her, if maybe she would finally accept defeat and slink away in shame. Then I saw it. On the street, Karen stood with a small group of her most loyal supporters, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. gesturing toward my house with wild frustration. Even from a distance, I could see the tightness in her posture, the way she scanned the neighborhood as if searching for allies. She wasn't giving up. She was regrouping. An hour later, the confirmation came. A text from a neighbor who had been at the meeting flashed across my phone. "Heads up, Karen is trying to get reinstated. She's arguing she was removed unfairly and wants to be an advisor to the HOA board." "She's definitely gunning for you." I smirked. Desperate moves from a desperate woman. But I wasn't just going to let her scheme unchecked. If she thought she still had a chance to claw her way back into power, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Karen was scrambling, and that meant I had already won. But I wasn't about to let her crawl back into power, not even as an advisor. Before she could manipulate her way into anyone's good graces, I decided to deliver the final blow. First, I sent an email to the HOA president, once again attaching the rental records as undeniable proof that Karen had no legal right to influence homeowner decisions. I made sure to highlight how many actual homeowners had spoken against her and pointed out that reinstating her in any form would be a direct violation of the bylaws they were supposedly upholding. Then, I did something Karen never saw coming. I went to her landlord. Public records made it embarrassingly easy to find out who actually owned the house she was renting. A few quick calls later, I had their contact information and left a carefully worded but very informative message. I explained everything, how their tenant, Karen, had been falsely presenting herself as an HOA official, stirring up disputes, and even involving the city in her personal vendettas. Then I added the real kicker. Her actions are now legally affecting your property. If lawsuits arise, you may be held accountable. Just something to consider. It didn't take long. By the next day, a for rent sign had been staked into Karen's front yard. The news spread like wildfire. Karen wasn't just off the HOA board, she was being evicted from the neighborhood entirely. Turns out, her landlord wasn't a fan of potential lawsuits and city complaints. They wanted nothing to do with her. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched as Karen stomped around her yard, yanking signs out of the ground and shouting furiously into her phone. Her usual smugness was gone. She looked frantic, desperate, genuinely lost. For a split second, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. 3 days later, the HOA held a follow-up meeting to finalize the leadership changes. I wasn't sure if Karen would show up, but I should have known better. Of course, she did. As soon as she walked into the room, the entire atmosphere shifted. No one met her gaze. No one offered her a seat. The power she once wielded so effortlessly had completely evaporated. She had lost her influence, her leverage, and any goodwill she might have once had. "I'd like to," she began, attempting to reinsert herself into the conversation. The HOA president shut her down immediately. "Karen, you are no longer a member of the board. You have no authority here." The words hit her like a slap. She physically recoiled, but she quickly straightened, clinging to whatever pride she had left. "I still have a right to be heard as a resident," she snapped. A murmur rippled through the room. The HOA president sighed, pulling out a document. "Actually, no. You don't." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" He held up her landlord's eviction notice for everyone to see. "Your lease has been terminated. As of the end of this month, you won't be a resident." Silence stretched across the room. Karen's face turned red, then pale, then red again. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked completely blindsided. You can't do this," she stammered. From the back of the room, a familiar voice called out, mimicking the condescending tone she had once used on the rest of us. "Oh, honey, looks like you're the one being removed from our community." Laughter erupted across the room. Real, genuine laughter. Karen's reign was officially over. Karen looked around, finally realizing, that she had lost, completely. With nothing left to say, she turned and stormed out. That was the last time anyone saw Karen in our neighborhood. Within 2 weeks she was gone. Her house was empty. Her reign of terror was officially over. That night, as I sat on my porch watching Karen's world crumble around her, I knew she was experiencing something she had never faced before: powerlessness. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the woman who had dictated rules and enforced fines with an iron fist, was now the neighborhood pariah. Her once loyal followers were nowhere to be found. Her reign of terror dismantled piece by piece. She paced in front of her house, still clinging to some last hope of control, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. I could hear the muffled, furious voice through the night air as she barked into the receiver, no doubt trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. But there was nothing to save. The next morning, her downfall became official. A moving truck pulled up in front of her house. At first I thought maybe she was just throwing in the towel, accepting her fate and leaving without a fight, but then I noticed her standing beside the truck, clipboard in hand, directing the movers with the same sharp authority she had once used on the HOA board. Karen wasn't leaving. She was planning a comeback. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Karen's hosting a meeting at her house. Says it's an emergency HOA restructuring discussion. What? She's not even on the board anymore. I thought she was getting evicted. Looks like she's trying to take back control before she goes, I smirked. Classic Karen. If she couldn't rule by title, she would try to rule by fear. Curious to see just how far she was willing to go, I took a casual stroll past her house. Cars lined the street, and from the sidewalk I could hear her voice carrying through the open windows, her usual condescending tone thick with urgency. The neighborhood has fallen into complete chaos since my removal, she declared. We need to take immediate action before it's too late. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Chaos? The only thing that had changed since she lost her grip was that people were actually happy. The neighborhood hadn't fallen apart, it had flourished. People talked to each other instead of reporting each other. Families set up swings and garden gnomes without fear of fines. Someone even put up a pink flamingo army in their yard just to celebrate the freedom from HOA tyranny. And yet, Karen was spinning a narrative of lawlessness and anarchy. A neighbor who had been inside slipped out and joined me on the sidewalk, shaking their head. She's losing it in there, they whispered. She just called the HOA president a spineless coward for letting you get away with what you did. I raised an eyebrow. What? I did? The neighbor smirked. You know. I chuckled. And what's her grand plan? Stage a coup? She wants to create a shadow HOA. I nearly doubled over laughing. A shadow HOA? She's saying that since she was unjustly removed, the current board is illegitimate. She's trying to get people to agree to follow her rules instead of the real HOAs. I sighed, shaking my head. Of course she is. As absurd as it was, I knew this was Karen's last stand. She had no legal power left, so she was resorting to manipulation and fear tactics, trying to claw back any sense of control, but it wasn't working. One by one, her so-called supporters trickled out of the meeting early, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some had attended out of curiosity, but after seeing how unhinged Karen had become, they wanted nothing to do with her. By sunset, only 3 people remained inside her house. By nightfall, she was alone. The next morning, the for rent sign in her yard had a bright red sticker plastered across it, lease terminated. Her time was officially up. She had fought, she had schemed, she had tried everything, and she had lost. A few days later she was gone. No dramatic farewell, no last-minute victory speech. Just a moving truck pulling away in the early morning light, taking the last remnants of her rule with it. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, a neighbor walked out onto their front lawn, took a deep breath, and let out a loud cheer. And just like that, Karen, the tyrant of the HOA, was nothing more than a bad memory. At first, the absence of Karen felt surreal. For so long she had been the dark cloud looming over our neighborhood, dictating what we could and couldn't do, handing out fines like party favors, making our lives miserable with her self-imposed rules. But now, with her eviction finalized and her house vacant, it was as if the entire community had been set free. In the days that followed, people started testing the newfound freedom that had once been unthinkable. One neighbor painted their mailbox neon blue just because they could. Another installed a wind chime, something Karen had once outlawed for being too disruptive to the ambiance of the neighborhood. Even something as small as kids leaving their bikes in their own driveways without fear of a violation notice felt like an act of rebellion. The paranoia that had settled into our bones was melting away, replaced with something we hadn't even realized we were missing: joy. I had my own little victory lap to take. That weekend I threw a real pool party, one where every single guest was actually invited. No uninvited strangers lounging on my patio furniture, no random people raiding my fridge, and best of all, no Karen. The neon green punch was the star of the show, an inside joke now, a tribute to the great pool incident that had ultimately led to Karen's downfall. People raised their glasses in a mock toast, clinking cups and grinning like co-conspirators who had pulled off the perfect heist. I still can't believe she actually thought she could run a shadow HOA, one neighbor laughed. She really thought we were just going to keep following her rules even after she got kicked off the board, another said, shaking their head. Like, what kind of delusion do you have to be under? I smirked. Well, I guess someone's following them. At that, everyone turned, eyebrows raised. Oh, you didn't hear? A neighbor leaned in, grinning mischievously. "Karen's already causing problems at her new HOA." I nearly spit out my drink. "You're kidding." "Nope," they said, taking a slow sip of their green margarita. "A buddy of mine lives over there. She moved in 2 days ago and immediately filed a complaint because someone's mailbox was the wrong shade of beige." Laughter erupted across the pool deck. "Oh my God," another neighbor wheezed. "She's learned nothing." "She really thought she could just go somewhere else and start over," I said, shaking my head, as if people weren't going to figure her out. Someone raised their glass again. "To Karen's new neighbors, may they survive the storm." We all clinked our drinks together, reveling in the fact that, for once, we weren't the ones dealing with her tyranny. And just like that, Karen became a legend. Her reign of terror in our neighborhood was over, but the stories, those would never die. Over the following weeks, it became a tradition. Whenever a new neighbor moved in, they were initiated into the community with the full collection of Karen horror stories. People told them like campfire tales, complete with dramatic reenactments. "She once fined me for putting up Halloween decorations before October," someone would say. "Oh, that's nothing. She measured my grass with a ruler and left a notice when it was half an inch too tall." She tried to make a rule that all front doors had to be a neutral tone, except guess whose front door was the exact shade of red she wanted banned. Every absurd detail was proof of just how bad things had been. And yet, the best part? None of it mattered anymore. With a new HOA board in place, actual improvements started happening. Karen's ridiculous rules were scrapped, and for the first time in years, meetings weren't about power trips and petty fines. They were about making the neighborhood a better place. Real changes. Real progress. Even the local news caught wind of the story. A reporter came by one afternoon wanting to hear about the Battle of the Gelats, how a tyrant had fallen and a community had reclaimed its voice. I gave them a tour of my backyard, standing beside my still perfectly clean, non-toxic pool, recounting the tale of the legendary neon green water. "So," the reporter asked, microphone in hand, "do you regret any of it?" I grinned, glancing at the small stone plaque near my gate, the one I had installed just days after Karen left. "Oh, since 2025. I took a deep breath of fresh, tyranny-free air and smiled. "Not one bit.